So if you'll turn to page 32, we stopped before by talking about active transport and how when we move big molecules or when we collect molecules, we have to use energy. And so what we're moving on to talk about is the type of energy that cells use. Cells use energy in the form of ATP. It's kind of like if you go to the vending machine and you try to put a $20 bill in, the vending machine's just not going to take that $20 bill. It's too big. It takes too much work to break it down into snack-size amounts. And that's exactly how your cells work. When you consume food for energy, now remember, the main things your cells use for energy are carbs and lipids. So when you consume those, there's a lot of energy in them. But your cells want to use small pieces of energy. So the form of energy, just like the vending machine takes quarters and dollars, the form of energy that your cell uses is something called adenosine triphosphate. You don't need to know the whole phrase, but I do want you to focus on this triphosphate. Because in a second, we're going to see the T turns into a D. What might that mean? So adenosine triphosphate, you have this picture here. Here's the adenosine and here are the three phosphates. And what we want to know is that between each of these phosphates is energy in a bond. What holds those phosphates together is a very high energy bond. And when we break that bond, we can release energy that can be used by the cell to do work. So when your cell needs to contract a muscle or actively transport using a protein, it needs energy to do that work. And the form of energy that your cell uses is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We break off one of these phosphates and we're left with ADP plus a single phosphate on its own. This ADP, the D stands for di, D-I. And that is another prefix, just like bi, that means two. So adenosine diphosphate. But this little phosphate doesn't completely go away, it's just hanging out there. Now if we had energy that we could put back in, then we could rebuild ATP. And if you look at this picture, that's exactly what cellular respiration does, is it rebuilds ATP. So ATP can be broken and rebuilt, meaning that it's recyclable in the cell. And it's pretty small, and so it allows the cell to use very small pieces of energy at a time. So you need to know what ATP is. It's the form of energy for the cell. And between these three phosphates, lots of energy. If I break one off, I have less energy. But if we use energy from our food, remember, we can break down food molecules. And we can actually use the energy that's in the carbs to transfer the energy into the bonds of ATP. And that's what cellular respiration is. Remember, we're trying to move away from thinking that respiration just means to breathe. Respiration in the cell is breaking down carbs like glucose. So we want to add that glucose is a carb, C-C-H-N-O, and it makes this diamond shape. That's glucose. It's a simple sugar. Now remember, starch is lots of those. So if you eat starch, your body will break it down into lots of small glucoses. Glucose is what cellular respiration breaks down. Most of the time, we're going to put a little star next to oxygen. Most of the time, the cell needs oxygen to perform this reaction. But what else? I could have a bag of sugar, and it's not being broken down. We do need enzymes. And those enzymes are going to help break down glucose, take the energy from glucose and put the energy into ATP. We'll end up with waste products like carbon dioxide and water. And so these are waste. The whole point of cellular respiration, this is our desired product. The whole point of cellular respiration is to get ATP. And that energy comes from the energy that's here in the sugar. So you need to know that cellular respiration is how all cells, all of them, whether it's a bacteria, a protist, a fungus, a plant, an animal, whatever type of living thing it is, it uses respiration to harvest or collect energy. We want to talk just a little bit more about where this happens. In eukaryotic cells, it happens here in the mitochondria. It's actually about 20 steps to get from here to here. We just need to memorize the overall equation. Glucose plus oxygen can be broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. And so that's the general formula. And it's mostly going to be happening here within the mitochondria, which means that two things are going to be moving in. Well, we don't need to use the word moving anymore. We have better words like diffusion. So oxygen is going to be moving in. We're going to use oxygen. And C6H12O6, this sugar, will also be moving into the mitochondria. Coming out, or diffusing out, will be three things. The gas, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So going in or diffusing into the mitochondria will be the reactants. These are called reactants. Also substrates. And coming out will be the products. The ultimate desired product is always ATP. Water and carbon dioxide are then released or excreted as waste. Aerobic respiration. Think of the word aerobics, like aerobic class. You're going to be using oxygen to break down sugars. It does take longer though, but it gives you more ATP. So aerobic respiration, where you use oxygen, produces a lot of ATP, but takes longer. Sometimes oxygen isn't available, and that's when we need to use something called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is when oxygen is not present. It's faster, but we produce less ATP. You're going to be doing a lab with an organism called yeast. And this yeast, when it's given sugar, will perform cellular respiration and fill this balloon up with a waste gas. You'll notice that the balloon traps anything from going in. So the yeast aren't getting oxygen. And that's why it's called anaerobic respiration. No oxygen available. Fungi, yeast, bacteria, and some plants are going to perform alcoholic fermentation. And so this is actually where wine and beer and all sorts of other alcohols come from, is from these organisms. We also want to add in that plants can perform alcoholic fermentation. Plants, bacteria, fungi, and yeast is actually a type of fungi. Yeast is an example of a fungus. And so when you do your lab, you're going to be using yeast. There's another type of fermentation. Notice this word fermentation means the same thing as anaerobic respiration. So fermentation and anaerobic mean the same thing. But alcohol can actually be pretty bad for animal brains. So animals are not going to perform alcoholic fermentation. They're going to perform something called lactic acid fermentation. And it's performed by some animal cells. Your brain can't do very much anaerobic respiration. Your brain needs oxygen because of how much energy your brain needs. So lactic acid fermentation is performed by some animals. The reaction still produces ATP, CO2, and water, but it produces lactic acid. So you'll notice that both types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic, produce ATP, CO2, and H2O. But when we do anaerobic, we don't completely break down the sugar. We end up with these leftover pieces. So this is a lot of information to explain how your body is actually able to get energy. When you consume foods, especially carbohydrates, your body will use cellular respiration to break them down. So take this time to work now on your summary box. Make sure that you use 2 words and refer to one of the pictures.